Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic today? Let's do it. What's the most messed up thing that someone has confessed to you in confidence? Please remember to like, share,
and subscribe.
Nice.
Had a coworker come to the house. He consumed alcohol, indulged in smoking, and engaged in other activities. Then after everyone cleared out, and it was just him and I, he got really weird and gave me a hug and whispered in my ear, "I hope this doesn't change anything, man, but I need to let you know that I've killed 2 people. I thought he was messing around, and when he left, I decided to search the name up. Sure as hell, dude had gotten out of prison just 3 years prior on murder charges. We're still cool to this day, and it seems like he's turned his life around and has become a pretty decent family man. But that night, he told me that just sticks with me." This one comes to mind, as it is, the most messed up thing someone has confessed to me in confidence. Interviewed someone many years ago to be a department manager. Solid guy, really knew his stuff. Hired him. He was great with staff and knew how to work with clients. Gripped all the nuances of the job, including the boring administrative stuff that we all hate, but he was spot on with it. There was another employee there with whom he had a great rapport. She wasn't his direct report, but she and he seemed to get along just super well. Chemistry as if they knew each other for years. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing beyond just being able to effectively work interdepartmentally. And when they worked on projects together, they were on task, focused, and delivered. Now this guy had pretty good chemistry with everyone else as well, but this one female just was like they were in sync. He had been with me for about 2 months. He was in my office one day. We were having lunch and just chatting about all topics not work related. The subject of family came up from him, not me. I told him, "My story's short, no kids, almost all family is dead, so I don't have anyone really anymore except me and my spouse." He smiled and nodded in what I would say is a kindly, empathetic way. At this point, he told me he has a large family and extended family, and started to give a small history lesson. This guy has a lot of family. A lot. As he's going down the line, he starts rattling off names, and one of them is the female I mentioned above. Find out she's his great niece. Well, damn. That explains how and why they get along so well when they work. They're family. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we have no problem with family members or relatives working for us, not an issue. As he concludes his conversation, he says to me, "You knew, right?" I said, "No, I had no idea you 2 were related, but it makes sense now." He looks at me, and he has a serious look on his face and says, "No, you know about us, right?" I looked confused, I assume, and said, "I don't know what you mean." He said, "My youngest daughter, she's the mother." That took me about 45 to 60 seconds to fully process what he was telling me. I finally said something along the lines of, "Nope, had no idea. Okay, great, this was fun. Let's do this again soon." My best employee is related to another good employee. It's great uncle and grandniece, and they've had sex and had a kid together. Oh, he was in his late 60s, and she was in her very early 20s. I checked and checked, but we had no policy against such. He quit about a month later. She stuck around for about another month and also quit. I strongly suspect it was due to him spilling the news to me, which, to this day, I just don't understand why he shared what he did, beyond her being his great niece. In that moment, he just chose to share. I assume it was due to the great sushi we had just had for lunch. Thus, that story takes the top spot in my book. Mine isn't really that messed up, so I guess I should consider myself lucky. One of my first girlfriends confessed that she'd never completed any schooling. She was homeschooled all her life and even a part of her graduation festivities for my high school graduating class. She was very fun and personable. One day she said she had something to confess and said her mom simply filled out all the paperwork and just copied test answers and mailed them in. I'm not sure how it all works, but She said she never studied anything or took a real lesson. I still really liked her, but the more I got to know her, the lack of basic knowledge started to become more and more apparent. Her math and science understanding was that of a small child. It was sad. Every once in a while, she'd say something so stupid it would catch me off guard and have me rethinking my life. I had a rough divorce. Kids were teenagers, very dramatic wife. It was a mess. The final straw in the marriage was my wife receiving a Facebook message from a stranger claiming they saw me embracing and having an affair with a woman who closely fit the description of one of my coworkers. I was not. A few years after the divorce, I started dating that same coworker after I had left the company, and after a while, she invited me to move into her home, which I did. We started a business together, and she asked me to look up some purchase orders on her computer. I opened the laptop, and Facebook was open to a profile I instantly remembered as that stranger. I was actually confused, and brought the computer to her and asked how this person's profile could be logged in on her computer. She took the computer from me with a proud smile and said, "It's really easy to create a fake profile on Facebook," and winked at me when she took the computer into her office. I thought my chest was going to burst. This bitch destroyed my family because she was crushing on me at work. To be fair, we were having issues, but breaking up the family was never mentioned until my wife got that message. I moved out a few weeks later. When I was an undergrad, I played on a club sports team for 1 season. A core group of players lived in a communal house and had a big end of the season party. I stopped by with some friends for some drinks but left early. I liked playing, but I didn't know them all that well. The next week I ran into one of them in one of the cafeterias. He was telling me about the party, how I should have stuck around. Then he pointed to a freshman girl who was sitting at one of the tables and said, "She got shit-faced drunk and a bunch of us pulled a train on her." I thought I was going to get sick. I don't remember what I said, but I left. I did tell a bunch of my friends. We smoked a lot of dope, we drank a lot of booze, and we chased after a lot of women. But that was not in our mentality. They were as pissed as me, and I never went back or hung out with the team again. The most messed up thing was not that they did it. Hell, it wasn't a confession he gave me. He was bragging. He was sick. But the most messed up thing was I did nothing about it. I didn't go to the cops. I didn't try to get her help. I just walked away from the situation. And that's messed up. I should have done something, anything. Instead, I just took the coward's way out. My best friend's dad ate a shotgun about 20 years ago after his wife left him. I wasn't there when the cops found and removed the body, but I did help clean up the crime scene, because nobody tells you that your responsibility for that is real, and crime scene cleanup crews are expensive, and prep the house for sale. My friend and his family went through therapy for a while, and then they moved across the country to be closer to his mom's friends, but we kept in touch. A few years ago, they temporarily moved back into the area before settling in a neighboring state, and I helped them with that move. My friend hadn't arrived yet, so it was just me helping basically a second mom, and when we stopped for lunch, she pretty much told me everything. Her ex-husband had been extremely abusive, but was really good at hiding it. So it took her over a decade to get out. The dad had bought a shotgun, updated the beneficiaries on his own life insurance policy, and took out policies on mom and all 3 of their kids, naming the aunt as beneficiary on all policies. He ate the shotgun a couple of weeks later. We think he had a last-minute change of heart about killing his kids, but we'll never know. They're all grown, some with families of their own, and they're quite happy as they are, so I don't think it will do any good to tell any of them, and I have no intentions of doing so. Their mom can, if she wants. 2 things. One was a chick that was in the group of friends I had at the time who got drunk and told me she had an 8-year-old son with severe Down syndrome. I had known this chick for 5 years, never a peep about a kid. She then admitted that shortly after he was born, she dropped him at her mom's and skipped town. Didn't talk to her mom ever again. I told that to the group, and they decided it wasn't a big deal. I'm no longer friends with them. The second thing is a former roommate ended up with 3 kids from 2 different women. One was his now ex-wife, and the other his baby mama that chased him for like 6 years for some unknown reason. I ran into him at a bar one night, and he told me how he manages to skip out on child support payments by claiming he can't afford to live on his 30 hours a week of work. I also know he has 5 rental properties he maintains, but they're technically under his parents' names, so the state can't include them on his income. I called him a douche and left the bar. I think I must have always had boring friends. The closest I can come to a friend confessing something messed up to me, at least he thought he'd messed up, was when a guy who was one of my best friends told me his secret. He told me we really had to talk in private, so I took him to my office and shut the door. Poor fellow looked miserable and like he always was in tears. Now, kept in mind, we were very close. We'd bled together in Vietnam and had stayed friends from then to right now. He started with, "You're going to hate me, and I won't blame you if you beat the shit out of me. I deserve it." I mean, now he was beginning to worry me. What the heck could he have done that I'd want to beat the shit out of him? It took him a moment to collect himself, and then he told me the dirty secret. "I'm sorry, buddy. I'm so sorry. I betrayed you. I effed your sister." LOL. I literally laughed so hard I was crying. "You mean Nancy?" And he nodded, looking at the floor unable to face it. "Oh geez, dude, you poor SOB. If Nancy decided she wanted a piece of you, you didn't stand a damn chance. If she decided the Pope should lose his virginity, she'd have it, and would then probably want to add a nun to her list of conquests. That gal could seduce a statue. You sure as hell don't have to apologize to me, bud." Oh, it was funny. I told the poor fellow to go back and get some more of her. He needed the relief. His wife had cleared their bank account and went off with another fella a couple years before this time. So he was a bachelor again, and I knew he wasn't getting much action in bed. He wasn't much of a ladies' man, kind of shy around women actually. When a mutual friend asked if she wanted children still, she said yes, but not with current partner. We said, "What? So you are breaking up?" She said, "No. She is planning to stay with him and get IVF with a sperm donor because he wasn't ready for kids or marriage yet. They've been together 15 years, 30-year-olds, etc." This then made us proceed with questions like, why wouldn't you just break up? Does he know? He did apparently. Surely he wouldn't want to live with that situation. You wouldn't really even be together anymore, etc., etc. They then proceeded to get engaged. I asked if the IVF was still on the table. She said it was if she lost weight that year. They're now married as of 2 weeks ago. I didn't go because the whole relationship is just weird at this point. And honestly, I think about this conversation about once a month.
So this is a 2-part comment. As far as the story we just listened to, it's difficult if you're in a relationship for so long, the things that you compromise in yourself, there's always going to be some level of compromise. There's nothing to be ashamed of. That's love. But when it comes to the fact that you're really disrespected, if you want that, good. And if you don't, get out. Also, the next story has a little bit to do with a barn fire and some injuries or death to horses. So if you don't like that, you just can skip ahead right here, okay? Have a great day, guys.
A coworker told me that when he was 7 or 8 years old, he was in his aunt's farm. He was playing with matches, lighting them, and throwing them in a bucket. Some hay caught fire, and things got out of control really fast. He closed the barn doors and went outside. The adults came running when they realized what was happening. Horses in the barn were making horrible noises. His father got the barn doors open, and horses with flaming manes came running out. A bunch of horses were killed, and others had to be put down. His aunt knew he had been involved, but he insisted he didn't do anything. His aunt blamed him, but his father took his side, and it caused a huge family rift. He said he had never told anyone and that the memory of the horses and the loss of the barn was a regret he carried all his life. I worked at Subway when I was 15, and I had a coworker named Michelle. Michelle was my dad's age, about 50. In fact, I later found out they had graduated high school together. She was a bit socially oblivious, a very loud talker, quite crass, very rude, and condescending to me and the other teenage employees. I was the only opener in that age group, and because of that, she got to sleep in on weekends and tended to be a bit buddy-buddy with me those days. Well, because at Subway, mornings tended to be quite slow, and one day she started talking to me about her sons that were a bit older than me. She tells me that her former husband was allergic to dander, and her sons really wanted a pet. They decided on a bearded dragon. They got their bearded dragon and were quite happy. His name was Skippy. Skippy liked to sit on the arm of the couch and watch TV with the boys after dinner, apparently. Well, one day, her sons want to play outside with Skippy and decide to take him on the trampoline. Michelle, with this really odd, dead-eyed, almost gleeful tone, tells me how she came home to Skippy exploded all over the trampoline. I live in California, and in 2016 or 17, I used to take Ubers all the time to buy weed from one of the dispensaries before they had the completely legal ones. And people tell you some crazy things when A, they know they'll never encounter you again, and B, they find out you don't mind towing the legal line using loopholes to get an otherwise illegal thing. I would normally set the ride up to be there and then back to my apartment, and most of the time, as soon as I got in the car, I'd tell them where we were going, just in case they weren't comfortable giving me a ride after. None of them ever had an issue with it. I had a lot of guys start talking about how they used to smoke a lot back in the day and bring up other minor illicit activities of theirs. There was this one guy in particular, though. He was an older guy who, on the way back to my apartment, asked if he could smell what I got. I hand him the capsules of weed I just bought. He opens it and takes a big whiff. He starts reminiscing out loud to me, but not just about weed, about cocaine, how he used to sell it. He brings up something I felt he should have kept to himself. He tells me he and a buddy of his were set to meet someone to either buy or sell some coke to. They arrive at the motel with their half and head to the room. He says upon entering the room, the guy they're supposed to meet with is there already. He's dead. Apparently still with his half of the trade in the room with him. So my Uber driver and his friend decide to leave with both halves, their own and the dead guy's. They never heard anything about it after. Now, I had so many questions, like, how did this guy they were there to meet with seem to have died? Was this something they dealt with before? Just how large of a deal was this? And why the fuck are you telling me? My only conclusion is the story was either completely made up by him on the spot, or this guy had just had this on his conscience for so long, building up, that he felt the need to get it out to someone he felt he'd never see again, and was at least just barely, even if only a sliver, a part of that underworld. My grandfather was born in 1919, so for my whole life, he was just a silly old guy who loved to make us laugh with jokes and stories of a different time. It wasn't until after he passed that I found out he was known as El Chino in his youth, and was the boss of the local zoot suit wearing pachuos. At his funeral, one of his lifelong friends told me about a time known local scumbag abused a neighborhood girl. El Chino rounded up his boys, and they beat the shit out of that guy, breaking his arm before my grandfather stuck a gun in his mouth and told him to leave town that night and never come back. That's the kind of man your abuelo was. He never let anyone get away with anything on our side of the tracks. It was absolutely jarring to think of my grandfather that way. He came home after that and told my grandmother what he had done, and she was so afraid he'd end up in trouble that she took the gun and hid it and went to her final rest decades later without revealing where it was. Weeks after my grandfather's funeral, we were emptying the house, and we turned up a revolver in a shoebox hidden in a crawl space, and the story I heard that day immediately came back to me. Okay, so this is a lot, so I apologize in advance. When I was in my early 20s and living in Houston, I was heavily addicted to cocaine, and in order to pay for it, I would go to script doctors and sell the pills they gave. When Hurricane Katrina hit,
Houston was flooded with refugees from Louisiana, and there was one particular apartment complex that seemed to have only been filled with New Orleans gang members and street prostitutes. I would say that roughly 70% of the people living in these apartments sold crack and powder cocaine. So I got to know quite a few of them and would either sell or trade my pills for their coke. All of the people living there scared the shit out of me. It was an easy process. I would walk up to the apartment gate, stand there a few minutes, and someone would come up and ask me if I wanted anything. I would then ask them the same thing, and the next thing I know, the transaction was complete. Every time I went, it would be someone new. The last time I ever went, I was approached by a black guy with long hair driving a Cadillac convertible. He was in his early 20s and asked me the same question everyone else asked. When I told him what I had, he told me to come up to his apartment to get more for the trade. I said okay, and followed him through the complex. We went through the building after building until finally coming to the very last building on the property, which seemed to be empty. When we got to the property, the second floor, I saw nothing but caution tape on all the doors and a partially caved-in roof at the end of the hall. I watched as he went to one of the doors, pulled out a key, and opened the apartment. I was shocked. Someone lived in this environment, but had seen worse, so I decided to follow him in. We started talking about the trade and working out a deal for future transactions. We finally settled on a deal where I would go to 2 doctors a week for him, and he would supply my addiction to me. I went to a doctor every day of the week, so it was a great deal for me. He paid me for the 120 doc visit, paid for prescriptions, and gave me drugs, and then I would still have 5 more doc visits a week where I just made a profit on the pills sold. After the deal was made, he told me to wait in the apartment while he went next door for the coke. Then he walked out the door and locked the handle. After about 15 minutes, I got restless and went to let myself out, but when I tried the door, I found that I was locked in. He had taken over this abandoned apartment and changed the lock to only lock from the outside. I started to freak the fuck out. I tried every room to see if I could leave, and when I went to the second bedroom, I was greeted by a girl dressed in a dirty yellow sundress. She was white, about 19 years old, and absolutely filthy. She told me to relax and that he would be back eventually and just have a seat until he is. There's so much more, but I'm trying to shorten this as best I can, so you all don't have to read too much. We started talking, and I asked her where she was from and asked about Katrina, basic small talk. For some reason, she begins to tell me how she ended up on the street. Here's what she said. When she was a sophomore in high school, she started dating a guy who was about 20 years old. He was pretty abusive and would shoot her up with drugs, but she stayed with him. One day, he picked her up from school, and on the way home, they saw one of her classmates walking. They pulled up to her and offered a ride. Apparently, she didn't get along too well with the one telling me the story, but they eventually convinced her to go with them. Also, they were headed the same direction because they lived only a few houses away from the girl. The boyfriend had been drinking and offered the girl a drink. She said no, which irritated the boyfriend, who then hit the girl across the face with a vodka bottle. He then pulled down a side road, beat her face multiple more times, and then killed her. Then they took the girl's body and buried it in an area behind the dead girl's house. She told me all this in the calmest way possible, like it was nothing. She then said that she and her boyfriend never went back to her actual house, had not seen her parents in years. I then realized who locked me in the apartment. Eventually he came back, and I asked if he wanted to take me to a doctor that day. He said he would, and we left. When he stopped for gas, I said I'd pay, and I walked in the store and then out the opposite doors. I then ran into an adult bookstore where I paid to go into the theater that was there. I then hid inside a booth for 8 hours until they kicked me out. I walked home, constantly looking over my shoulder. I never went back to that apartment complex. I rented a room from an older guy, Rob, in his late 1980s in college. Rob, he was a super cool dude.
He was a Vietnam vet and had that air of someone who had seen some shit. He was a nurse at a local hospital and worked an early shift. Great guy. Knew tons of stuff. Everyone in our little neighborhood liked and appreciated him. I could go to the local Irish pub and get in without an ID because everyone there knew I was his housemate. Rob was also an extremely high-functioning alcoholic. He would get completely blasted every single evening, but be up and sober and out of the house by 5 a.m. for a shift. Never saw him drink during the day. At the end of the school year, I had just finished all my finals and papers and was getting ready to head out for a study year abroad in a few days. That evening, Rob asked if I wanted to celebrate with him. We started with a bottle of Jameson, about 3/4 full. About 4 drinks in, Rob started to go into his inebriated side. In the year that I'd lived with him, he never spoke about Vietnam, and I knew better than to ask. But that evening, he asked if I wanted to know what he did there. I had always assumed he was a nurse or medic there, or had just been either a regular GI who had done the usual horrible war stuff. Turns out, he was part of the Phoenix program. Basically, he was sent into North Vietnam on CIA assassination missions. He was a sniper. A lot of his targets seemed to be civilians. He said he drank because he saw the faces of the people he killed every evening. He also said a lot of other stuff that I don't remember for obvious reasons. Anyway, we ended up polishing off the bottle that night. The next morning, I heard him get up and out the house at 5 a.m. I spent the entire day alternating between praying to the porcelain god and curling up in a fetal position on my futon. We never spoke of it again. Had a friend who was a licensed therapist, and we became close through a shared hobby. One day she admitted to me that as a teenager, she used to torture animals, and she plotted ways to kill her mother. I figured this was because she had an abusive childhood. However, things eventually got very weird when she began to tell our mutual friends strange things I had never said. For example, that I was bragging about bringing a weapon to hurt someone. She also tried to gaslight me in the classic sense. For example, one time she called me and insisted our friend was with her when she physically could not have been, as the friend had just left an event with me over an hour away. Just very bizarre things, like she was trying to make me feel crazy. We were not friends for long after that started, but I wish her well, but I would never be friends with our therapist again. My parents were narcissistic in a huge way, and a social worker suggested counseling for me. My mom could lay it on so thick you could cut it with a knife. My mom and I spoke to a psychiatrist as part of counseling, sometimes one-on-one sessions. At one point, the psychiatrist said they couldn't believe that my mom was the way I had described her. I had told the psychiatrist that she could believe whatever she wanted to believe because I had to live with my narcissistic parents, and really was much different for me. The psychiatrist told me something at that moment that I could never ever forget. I can say whatever I want, and everyone will believe me. Your parents will believe me. Social services will believe me. The police will believe me. The judge will believe me. Even everyone who works for the state will believe me. What you say could not possibly be true based on what I've seen so far. If I say you're out of control and tell your parents that, and tell social services that, I can have you put in juvenile hall until you're 18. I had very limited contact with my parents after I moved out, but I have a special loathing for psychiatrists after that. Before we broke up, my ex told me that as a kid, he was friends with this kid in his class who was mercilessly bullied. He was this kid's only friend. My ex was bullied too, but not as badly, and partly bullied for being this kid's friend. This kid had HIV, AIDS, and other stuff and got sick a lot. He was on medication that he needed to stay alive. This was in the early 2000s, not in North America. Anyways, one day my ex decided he was tired of being treated like a loser at school and had had enough. So he joined in. He bullied this kid and said crueler things than anybody. He targeted his weak spots that he knew from their relationship. This kid's only friend turned on him. The kid stopped taking his medication, and next day, he refused. Very shortly after the kid died. My ex said it was because his former friend told him that if he stopped the medication, he would soon die, and he was glad to have a friend because he was so bullied, but sometimes didn't want to be alive. My ex said himself that it was his fault that the kid stopped his meds and ended his life because he betrayed their friendship and took the bullying to such an extreme level. I feel very sorry for that kid and his family. I'm glad my ex is an ex. A woman who was a sensei in a jiu-jitsu studio owned by her elderly father for many decades told my brother that when she was in her 20s she left a bar and a drunk local followed her home, pestering her to hook up. She wasn't afraid of him, just annoyed. She told him to get off the porch and go home while opening her door. She was a highly trained martial artist herself, so she really wasn't worried. He pushed his lit cigarette into her face, missing her eye because she turned her head, but burning her cheek. She ran in the house and slammed and locked the door. She definitely wasn't thinking about engaging him with her martial arts training. She knew to get away. According to her, she called her dad, who knew who the guy was. He told her, "Don't call the police. He'd take care of it." The dude was never seen again. He was a drifter type, living in a rooming house, so people assumed he just left town. But the woman told my brother her dad was a hothead back then, and anything could have happened. He might have scared the guy into leaving town. He might have turned him up so badly that something tragic occurred. Her dad never spoke of it, and she didn't ask. My mom told me that she originally wanted to abort me. My dad had drinking and gambling problems, and they could barely afford rent while feeding my older sister what little scraps they had. So my mom got fed up and was close to leaving my dad, but then she got pregnant with me. He convinced her to keep the pregnancy, promising that he'd stop gambling and change for his new baby. He didn't. We eventually became homeless. My mom finally left him and took my sister and me with her. Years later, we're financially stable and everything is good. No idea where dad is. Objectively, I understand why my mom wanted to abort me. She also said she didn't want me to suffer extreme poverty as a baby, and I did go through a lot because of my family's circumstances. But emotionally, it's hard for me to get over. My dad essentially used me to baby trap my mom into staying in an abusive relationship with him. If it weren't for me, my mom and sister wouldn't have suffered too much. I know it's not my fault, but it still feels like it is. I also know that my mom loves me very much, but I also feel pain knowing that she originally didn't want me. In her better world, I shouldn't exist.